But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. What is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity.
We've gone through the same situation we're going through over and over again for the last 100 years. And after every single one of those racial demonstrations or riots, a commission is usually put together, or a hearing or investigation to say, we've got to find out what the root causes of this. In fact, it's usually a police action that sets off these street demonstrations. Those are the sparks that set off what I think is a fuel that has been festering for over 100 years. And that fuel is the wealth disparity, the racial discrimination that leads to lower quality of life in communities of color.
I'm fighting for the chance to walk out and not have to be paranoid. I'm fighting for my chance to actually feel protected by the people that are supposed to protect. I've cried over this for years. We've been fighting the same battle, and yet here we are. We're still doing the same thing. Nothing has changed.
You have to ask yourself, how did this come to be? And it doesn't take a lot of sleuthing to find our own government's history of redlining, of racially restrictive covenants, of racial zoning, which essentially is a form of apartheid. It's a form of government-sanctioned separation of people by race. And over generations, as people passed on their assets to their children, you saw that housing in these red line neighborhoods never accumulated the kinds of values that it did in other mostly white neighborhoods.
All of these actions, whether it was public housing or the creation of suburbs or many, many other policies that the federal government followed, were unconstitutional. They violated the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. And when state and local governments created similar policies to ensure segregation, they violated the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. We know that if there's a constitutional, a civil rights violation, we have an obligation to remedy it. But when it comes to these policies to create residential segregation, we've never taken it upon ourselves to assume that obligation that we all have as American citizens.
It's no coincidence that we've had 100 years of racial street demonstrations, and we've had 100 years of racial discrimination in home ownership and in redlining. The two are connected. We need a new paradigm, a new way of addressing racial unrest, disparity, division in our country, and that is through creating home ownership.
So the new paradigm is a way of getting fundamentally different and more racially and economically equitable outcomes for people in California around home ownership. And it's about bringing people together for real action. So new players coming together, public, private, civic, labor, folks saying we really need to not just think about this issue, but we actually need to take significant steps through public policy, through private action, to get different outcomes for communities of color.
If you think about the statistics, homeowners have 44 times the wealth as renters. Homeownership isn't a housing issue, it is a wealth building policy, a wealth building initiative. It's the number one way that we can bridge the wealth gap between white and communities of color. There's also a lot of data that has proven just the stabilizing effect that homeownership has on families, on education, on having something to fall back on during hard times. So there really is just an overall downstream effect on the entire community.
It's almost like that equality image where you see the little boy looking over the fence. He needs more milk carts to be able to be equitable. And unless we can really figure that part out, there's a lot of conversations and narratives that makes others feel better, but the truth is that there has to be some systems in place to make this an equitable conversation so that all people can participate in this thing called the American dream, that all people can participate in this economy, and no longer should there be one segment of people to determine or control who can play and who cannot.
The model minority myth was set up to pit the Asian community against everyone else. It really robs us of the solidarity with other communities of color in suffering. We are all in this country victims of discrimination, systemic racism, and it robs us of the truth. But in addition, when enlightened leaders say, hey, we want to help communities of color, people who are in need or underserved communities, the last person they think of are Asians because of this model minority myth. The Asian community has been long neglected and overlooked and omitted in any of these efforts and discussions.
COVID-19, this epidemic has really unmasked significant health inequity in the United States, particularly for African Americans and Latinos and Pacific Islanders and some other populations. And what COVID-19 does is essentially it unmasks the social vulnerability that's the product of really decades, if not centuries, of policy designed to injure the opportunity for African American populations and other populations.
The pandemic is an illness that is spreading. So has racial discrimination been an illness. And I think, we have a vaccine that will start addressing the pandemic. And I think what we need, the new paradigm can be a vaccine that can be addressing the racial disparities in our country, treating them the same. They're both illnesses and sicknesses.
Policy experts, housing experts, think tanks, journalists spin out ideas all the time about what we can do to redress racial segregation. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement, like the one we had in the 1960s, that's going to make it uncomfortable to maintain the segregated patterns that we now have.
To close the wealth gap in the Bay Area, it is critically important that the thousands of blighted, vacant properties that are here get leveraged and utilized. So giving the opportunity to emerging developers, smaller developers that would be extremely benefited by the opportunity to build, and that we have to be savvy disruptors. We can't be okay. We can't be okay that, since there's no more marches and protests, that everything is okay. And because the hashtags are gone, that everything is okay.
The first thing we have to do is we have to tell the truth about how we've got here. We have to essentially have racial reconciliation, truth, and healing. We have to talk about the policies that were designed to hold African Americans and other populations back. We have to talk about how African Americans and other populations were excluded from policies intended to benefit people, sometimes referred to as white affirmative action, like the GI Bill. Quite frankly, we have to talk about the fact that in this country, we haven't learned the lessons that the rest of the world has learned. We're all part of the same tribe, and that we all have to see each other's shared humanity. And so leadership which tries to separate us and divide us brings us all down. At the end of the day, we're all better off when we are all better off.
I believe that if our country could set it up in such a way, this racial equity initiatives that allows looking at each community and seeing where have they been lacking, where have they been overlooked, Where have they not received is just investment, and be able to then allow each community to grow and reach their full potential.
What happened to George Floyd is not an isolated incident, and as a Latino man, it is my responsibility to act in solidarity with my black and brown brothers and sisters, because an injustice against one is an injustice against all of us.
We need to build more housing. That is the #1 priority, to ensure that prices are lowered. There's actually access for first-time home buyers to be able to find that home at an affordable rate. You're shutting out an entire community, the very community that is the future of the state, the future of this country, that is going to be the necessary stimulus to our economy.
It's been a tough year. From the pandemic to the economic downturn to the protests for racial justice, it's been a very difficult time, especially for those people at the lower end of the income spectrum, but I'm hopeful that this has really galvanized us as a California community to create substantially more race equity in the state, and home ownership is really the linchpin to closing the racial wealth gap.
We have to reassess how we think about housing. We can't just treat it as a commodity for the marketplace. Should we be using just market principles to allocate this critical resource, or is housing a fundamental human right? So that we have to ensure that everybody has realistic access to a dignified way to live.
We need what I would consider like Roosevelt's New Deal. That New Deal created an avenue for our country to get out of the Depression from the 1929-1930. And the major part of that New Deal was to make home ownership available to lower income families. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to happen overnight on it, but it'll be a major step to resolving this issue. Wouldn't that be something if we use the racial disparities and the discrimination in this country to bring this country together in all of the other areas? It would be amazing.
And so I refuse to despair. I think we're going to achieve our freedom, because however much America strays away from the ideals of justice, the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up in the destiny of America.
We are here to acknowledge the black people who built this country against their will, the black women who birthed this country, the reparations we still have yet to take, not receive, and all the brown and especially black bodies who have been murdered at the hands of police and white supremacy. The names we know and the names we will never know.
We don't need another commission or hearing or investigation to uncover the root causes of racial inequity.
Redlining and other exclusionary housing policies have created a huge inequitable wealth gap.
Increasing homeownership is key. It's the key to creating new wealth. It did it for white America, and it can do it for the rest of America too.
New wealth leads to improved quality of life.
It closes the racial gaps in education, employment, and health.
We need a new paradigm, a new way of creating wealth for all of us, a new way that brings us racial harmony and a new peace in America.